Now, what we're going to do with our panellists over here, so we've got Alastair Dick from Gold Coast Marine. Welcome, Alastair. Rachel McKenzie from Berries Australia, Therese Tobin from the Gladstone Ports Corporation, and Michelle McKinlay from Australian Banana Growers Council. Okay, guys, what I'm going to ask is if you could just talk a little bit about yourself. You've got 3 to 4 minutes, then tell us about your recent biosecurity incident and what you needed to do within the first 48 hours and perhaps some of the learnings and experiences that came out of that. Who's kicking off?
Okay. Is it on?
Go. Yes.
I'll start. I'm Therese Tobin. I work for the environment team at Gladstone Ports Corporation. We ended up having red imported fire ants back in 2013 and it was successfully eradicated, and we ended up with a resolution notice in 2016, which was wonderful. But I think the thing is we'd never thought about this happening before, even though there had been a small outbreak previously in Gladstone. It wasn't something that was on our radar or anything like that. But the first couple of days, the most important thing is I think that we did act nimbly and agilely towards working with Biosecurity Queensland. I wrote down a couple of notes. There were some key things for us and it was successful, and I think that's because we were very cooperative. And whatever you need, what are you looking for? What do you need? What resources do you need? What people do you need? What maps do you need? Do you want to know what the site constraints are or what the site characteristics? What do you need to get in and get stuff happening? We were very collaborative as well. There's the site is Fisherman's Landing, and it's an industrial area, and we're probably very fortunate that it's got about 20 lessees, and they're all large commercial type establishments, and they were also quite wanting to be part of the solution. I think it'd be a different situation if it was, obviously what you have in the southeast Queensland corner with smaller land holdings. And there was a commitment from us all. And we have a site coordinator at Fisherman's Landing. You might all know him, Mike Dixon. And he actually, was that conduit, made sure the meetings were happening, made sure that everything that needed to be done was done. So that was our experience. Now the port does take biosecurity quite seriously, and hence why I'm here. And so for us, it was a really good experience. And I think if we did anything differently, it's just making sure that our emergency plans recognise things like biosecurity. That's probably, there'd be some organisations who haven't quite got there yet. Think of other emergencies, but maybe not biosecurity. And for us, even though we hadn't thought about it, we were quite willing to be part of that solution.
So, Therese, how difficult was it to get all the businesses in the Port Corporation fully engaged in your response?
Well, I think when it happened, the first thing there was communication from the very senior levels of the organisation out to everyone in the business, how important it was. And no matter what is required, just go out there and make it happen and get to the end. And so I think was probably the key thing it is good communication channels and from senior levels of the organisation as well. Our lessees and tenants as well also know what the impact can be, so they were quite happy to come along as well. But it was just a matter of keeping those communication channels open, timely, and that's, I think, what added to the success.
So now that we've raised the awareness in the Ports Corp and the importance of biosecurity, how are you going to keep that up there front of mind?
How do we? We actually have a communication strategy for environmental things, and biosecurity at the moment sits under environment, and it is actually, one of those key topics. So we're out there trying to educate within the port about all different things environmental, including biosecurity, get on the front foot, do some education internally. We also do Facebook posts, and we try and get out there and influence the public as well. So, so that's hopefully people pick up those feeds and realise that, and get some education from that too.
Very good. All right, thank you. But pass on to Alistair. Tell us where you're from, Alistair, and your incursion issue.
Yeah, well, Alistair Dick, I'm General Manager at Gold Coast Marine Aquaculture, and unlike Teresa's experience, our experience was a very unpleasant one. And unfortunately, again, unlike Teresa's experience, one that was also highly predictable. So there's two kind of major differences there. Helen was our executive officer with our association. I know when, for instance, when we searched back through our archives, we found 18 separate submissions leading into 2016, and in fact, even the federal government's own import risk assessment reviews pretty much highlighted the incursion pathway that actually happened. So
White spot in prawns.
Yeah, white spot in prawns. So yeah, it was pretty much as per the script. In 2016 was the year that I started with Gold Coast Marine. I've been involved with the industry. I think this is my 34th year now. And probably, fortunately for me and for Gold Coast Marine, I actually studied under Professor Leitner at the University of Arizona in prawn diseases. So I was somewhat in a fortunate circumstance to arrive at the farm at the time that the incursion happened. But the way that the incursion happens and the way the response rolls out is quite different from what you expect it to. You've got a lot of emotional, psychological things going on. You've got your owners watching their life's work go down the gurgler on them, and you've got a lot of tears and all the rest of it. So for me as a manager, managing all of that stuff, including the staff and access to the site and whatever, is a highly emotional and challenging experience. But in saying that, necessity is also the mother of all invention when it comes to these things. So to say we were ill prepared in terms of a white spot response, well, that's a very, very onerous kind of statement to make, because it's virtually impossible to be fully prepared for white spot. It is the foot and mouth of prawns. So when white spot hits a naive population of prawns, it will kill pretty close to 100%. And so with a exotic disease response under the AquaVet plan, which I've made a few notes on as well, which obviously is a document that needed reviewing. Just from a purely operational perspective, the volumes of chlorine required, was kind of fortunate that there was a new chlorine plant in Brisbane built in the lead up, and we still tapped out the supply of chlorine. And Alison may be able to help me out here, but I think it was somewhere in the vicinity of 15 to 20 million litres of chlorine we used to kill all those prawns down there. It was quite staggering. And, to see that chlorine go into your ponds and to watch your stock die in front of your face is a very unpleasant experience. So there's obviously been some changes made about, more humane ways to euthanize prawns, and some of that stuff has gone before the federal government in terms of minor use permits. During a response, we're kind of under the emergency use permit kind of regime, where it's more up to the lead biosecurity agent to arrange those things. But certainly some of the challenges at the time were managing access to the site. You've got a lot of people coming to the site, and their objectives are clear. And in such circumstances, when eradication is our primary goal at that point, that there's some pretty harsh stuff going on, and to be able to manage that at a site level is challenging. You've got a lot of people, and by their own admission, a lot of those people hadn't dealt with aquatic disease responses before, and clearly this was the largest aquatic disease response in Australian history. So, having, for instance, and we actually made a lot of really long-lasting relationships and friendships out of this experience, despite some of the uncomfortable situations you find yourself in. But, some of the people for instance, who come from the cattle industry, when they looked into a prawn pond, they literally didn't know what they were looking at on the first day, and the turnover of staff and the lack of skill in the early part was definitely an issue, and I think Biosecurity Queensland certainly acknowledges that, and obviously since then I'd say that skill base has certainly come a long way.
So how effective do you think, with the benefit of hindsight and all the emotion and everything else, how effective was the government's engagement in relation to the response?
Well, look, it was very difficult to manage at that level because the objectives were clear, and obviously from a farm management and ownership responsibility level, our objectives are clear. We didn't want to, heighten the risk to the environment and to the broader farming industry, but also we had we weren't ground zero. We were IP6, so we'd seen 5 other farms succumb in front of us, and we could see, we could see it coming. And of course, that's a very challenging thing in itself. So my focus was clearly one of monitoring and trying to prepare ourselves for the, for the finality that, there was a pretty good chance we were going to lose our crop, and all of those things that meant about risk management in terms of were we at a stage where we could get some cost recovery on our crop? Because one of the things with white spot worldwide is that you're almost at the point of full exposure when white spot hits you. So in other words, you've incurred all the cost of your hatchery, you've incurred a decent amount of the cost of your labour and feed, and you lose your crop before you can recover anything from it. So you're at the highest point in the exposure, on the exposure curve. So to be able to try and get some sort of cost recovery is obviously is front and centre in your thinking, despite the overarching objective of eradication. So the gathering of important information, making sure that the right samples are collected and there's reference samples, and you're doing everything within the within your GBOs and within the guise of the of the eradication effort. And I'd say fortunately, and maybe not from Biosecurity's angle at the time, that the FRDC did allocate a field vet officer in Ben Diggles, who was actually very useful and in a way acted as a liaison officer, and maybe someone that was kind of could see things somewhat independently at the time. So I think that was very useful, and probably a really good lesson for the future, that we don't only have farmers and biosecurity, that there is some form of independent, I don't know about independent, but some form of liaison that goes on between. Obviously, as we moved forward, we had to worry about our staff, their employment, and thankfully we did get obviously some money from the government, and we did have a farm in far north Queensland, so we managed to keep operating. But the impost of white spot is still with us today in a major way. You have a large proportion of your income taken away, but your impost in terms of managing biosecurity, I think in the first year alone, just for our small farm in North Queensland, we spent something like $200,000 on diagnostic testing to make sure that we weren't, transferring diseased prawns around, and we're testing all our brood stock and complying with the with the government policy. So
I might bring you back from a year back to 48 hours.
Yeah. Yeah.
So in those first 2 days, what were the biggest 2 or 3 things for your industry in those first 48 hours?
Well, I'd say managing access to the site, and also the whole cost recovery part of it, and also obviously managing that eradication
and probably
process.
the uncertainty around that as well.
There's a huge amount of uncertainty going on at the time, that's for sure. And
All right, we could go on prawns all day, but we
Yeah,
better
I've
not.
spent way too much time on this stuff. Like I did the import risk assessment for the association, which was over a 100-page document. Did 2 Senate inquiries and sat there and done a number of biosecurity plans that I've written for the industry and whatever. So yeah, there's I could talk about white spot for about the next 5 days
I'm
if
sure
you
there's
wanted to.
plenty of learnings,
Yeah.
plenty of learnings out of that incursion in white spot in prawns. But thank you for sharing those difficult issues with us. All right, Michelle, your turn. Let's talk about bananas.
More bananas. So to reflect on the first 48 hours, I guess the advice is don't panic. It's very easy to be panicked when you think of the scale of what's about to happen and the impact that it's going to have on growers, many of whom are your friends. And I guess it's about working really closely with your biosecurity agency and knowing that they know the hoops that need to be jumped through. So use them as your guide because they can tell you all of that side, all of the CCEPP type side of what needs to happen. They've got roles and responsibilities clearly defined and people trained in their agency to do those jobs, and that's a great thing. You also need to obviously interact and engage with your growers, and you get this sweet spot of time, it's not very much, when the infected property knows, the biosecurity agency knows, and the peak body knows, and no one else does yet. And so that's your moment to really get your shit together and plan how you're going to use the next few days to weeks in a really strategic sort of way, because once it hits the newspapers or it hits grower land, life is bonkers and it stays like that for months. And you get calls off into the office from growers who are trying to understand what's going on. So trying to give them content information in a really efficient sort of way is very difficult. Trying to then, the next step, which isn't your 48 hours, but it's not long after that, is trying to work through them. What can they do on their farm to keep this off? And by a lovely coincidence, we've actually got someone in the audience, Sarah Simpson, who at the time, or almost around that initial time, Sarah was recruited into ABGC and she ran workshops for growers and they looked at their farm and they sort of said, where are your hot spots? What can we do to try and do that? So we help growers because they really didn't know what to do. So it's sort of working with those who your key customer, if you like. But then there's all sorts of odd bods who ring in who have got solutions and they've got products to sell you. And I had a very long conversation with a man who told me all we needed to do was go and dig a really big hole, pour all of the dirt in it, cement it over and we'd be fine. Now that conversation took about half an hour. Could not get him off the phone, knowing that phones were running hot, emails were by the thousand, and it's like, oh. So you just don't know. That time that if you can get yourself organised really helps you get off on the front foot for the response.
So I understand you had a special role in being the industry liaison.
Yep.
So what were the game of those two things, the first 48 hours that you're very cognizant of in terms of that response?
Look, to be honest, part of it is a blur. We worked such phenomenal hours. We got little sleep from worrying. But certainly I would come into what was PIB, but into Biosecurity Queensland, and I would sit with other officers who had done this before. So that was actually quite a reassuring thing. So I was a conduit from BQ land and speak to grower land. And it was quite exhausting. And
I suspect in those first 48 hours, BQ was really your lifeline.
Well, they're a lifeline to lots of things, but as I said at the start, mostly around what needs to happen. From just mobilising themselves on the ground to, putting quarantine in on farms, what that meant. We were trying to work with that grower, the really heightened emotional state. What does that mean? What does that mean for the surrounding growers? Knowing it's a soil-borne disease and there had been rain and floods, where is it now? there was a thousand questions, and we were lucky to get answers to 2 or 3 each day. It was really difficult.
Yeah, okay. A lot of similarities there with Alistair about the uncertainty, and you don't know what you don't know, really. Good old Donald Rumsfeld.
I had our office vet a lot of those calls because we were getting a lot of them as well. And I said to Sharon in our office, if they can't tell you what the technology is and how it works, don't put them through to my number.
And we did that too in the end, but I guess it sort of catches you a bit ill-prepared. You're having the conversation before you realise it. So, we did put that in place. And in the end, we had to have a whiteboard up to say who'd spoken to who about what, so that we could, turn that over, because we all had different roles and responsibilities and client, customers or stakeholders to engage. And then there was, all the politicians want to know what's going on, all the journalists want to know. And it was just this, amazing crush.
Well, thank you for taking on that industry liaison role. I've obviously had some outbreaks of issues in my jurisdiction over the years, and that is a very difficult role. Someone from industry to step into that role and be that conduit between the agencies and the industry. And it can sometimes be a thankless task because you'll have people on the phone telling you where to go and bury it and do everything else. So seems like you got yourself through it, and I bet you got a whole lot of learnings out of it.
I'm a lot more grey now than I was before TR4.
All right, thank you for that. Now, last but not least, Rachel, you're going to talk to us about a bit of a different issue and your berry scare last year.
Well, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Rachel Mackenzie. I am the Executive Director of the newly formed Berries Australia, which encompasses the revitalised Strawberry Australia. And I think that we can say that the berry crisis of last year perhaps contributed to us being in the place we're in now. So that's the silver lining. But I think, and I am very conscious that there's the guys from Department of Health here who have different perspectives and different insights on this issue. But it's interesting that you raised the Donald Rumsfeld known knowns and known unknowns, because I think the thing that I've reflected most on is that at this time last year, if anyone had said, what is going to be the biggest issue that will take over your life and basically bring an industry to its knees, cause massive ramifications and make global media, I would never in a million years have said that it was someone putting needles in strawberries. And so I think that highlights to me, and I think it's really important that we do risk planning where we look at the identifiable risks and we put in place the mitigation strategies and we do all those good and sensible things. But I think we have to be conscious that no matter how well prepared we are and no matter how many processes we go through, there will always be something that catches you off guard. So we actually have to build the resilience within our industry and our systems to enable us to react to the issue that you can't foresee. And I think that was a big learning for us. I think the question around 48 hours is a particularly interesting one because, and it highlights again to me that actually the biosecurity system, whilst it's not perfect, because people understand what their roles and responsibilities are, the communication pathways are open, you have forums like this, you have identified go-to people, you have the plant pest response deed, PHA, all of that infrastructure. When something happens in that first 48 hours, like you said, there was a sweet spot. The spot where you knew what was going on, the department knew what was going on, the affected farmer knew what was going on, but the media and other people didn't know what was going on. For us, we found out about the needle tampering crisis via the media. The Strawberry Industry Development Officer at the time, I found out, I was in a taxi in Canberra and I remember it quite clearly because I just got this text with a profanity and then a link and I went, oh, what's this? And basically it was an article and the Queensland Chief Health Officer had done a media statement and we found out through the media. We had, and I don't think anyone could have foreseen the level of media interest in this issue. We were talking hundreds and hundreds of media inquiries a day to the point that the Industry Development Officer turned her phone off. So I think that everybody was taken by surprise by how much media interest this garnered and what the long-term consequences for industry would be, which was that effectively that Coles basically shut down or stop buying strawberries. The thing is with strawberries is once you stop growing them, you spray them out. and you're done for the season. So the implications on those growers, particularly those who supplied into Coles and Aldi, were enormous. I think that, like I said, I think that the first 48 hours for me was just a time of scrambling around to find information, really having no concept of what the implications or consequences would be, and regularly being, feeling that we were on a pathway and then being sideswiped by some other announcement from interstate jurisdictions. And again, I think this highlights the robustness of the biosecurity system in that there are clear mechanisms for reporting to the media. And I think that unfortunately the Queensland Government and Queensland Health, I think once we sort of got in the tent and got started, Queensland DAF, Queensland Health started engaging with industry, and we were all sort of like, right, okay, we're all in the same tent. And then the New South Wales Police would just randomly report on hoax and copycat incidents, which then inflamed the issue, and that's when Coles and Aldi made that decision, and that was the decision that had the long-term impact and consequence for industry. And I think it is, again, unlike the other examples that we've heard, particularly, with the bananas and with the white spot, where the actual long-term consequences of the incursion are enormous. In this particular instance, and I don't know the exact numbers, Tenille might be able to correct me, but it was something like there were only around 20 initial incidents of tampering from the initial incident. But overall, there was more than 200 reports of tampering. And of those, there was a significant proportion that were just hoaxes. And then of those, there were some that were copycats. So this was a phenomenon of social media, of actual media, and perceived risk as opposed to actual risk compared to a lot of other things. Now, obviously, there's the human health risk. And I know that, you look at things like the melons and listeria, there was, in terms of the human health impacts, that was significantly more damaging, but didn't capture the public imagination in the same way. And I know the melon industry sometimes grumbles and says, how come you got all this money and we didn't get all this money? And I can understand that too, but it really did capture everyone's imagination. And then I guess the funny thing was, once we sort of got the police kind of calmed down, the politicians all jumped on the bandwagon. I met Scott Morrison and spoke on the phone to Bill Shorten, and it was really quite extraordinary, the level of interest that this garnered. And I think yes, that first 48 hours for me was predominantly one of confusion, but we moved forward, and I think one of the positive steps that was taken, it wasn't by me, was the president of the Queensland Strawberry Growers Association is a rather flamboyant, stereotypical Italian man, and I think that he had a very strong emotional antenna, and that was really critical because he rang every single strawberry grower himself. And then on the Monday, we had a grower meeting in that had almost the entire industry. The minister came, the chief health officer came, a very senior person within Queensland Police came, and that went a very long way in terms of building relationships and building bridges and opening communication lines. And I think we've learnt some incredible lessons out of this particular incident. I think for me the testament was when there was that recent screw found in some strawberries. I got a call from Coles. Oh, just letting you know, we found this. This is what's happening. And then I rang Queensland Health and said, are you aware of it? They said, no, but we'll get straight on to our South Australian people. This is not how it's supposed to roll. And it lived and died on one night. And I was like, thank goodness. And I think that the community and the social media, everybody's sick of it. We need a new issue to get all excited about on social media.
So was your industry surprised about the immediate effect on consumer behaviour?
Surprise doesn't even begin to explain it. But I think the difference is that consumer behaviour is one thing, but in horticulture we are so dictated to by the behaviour of the major retailers. And a major retailer making a decision based on a police report that turned out to be unverified was very problematic.
Yeah, well, it was very unusual, that response, but those of us who work in the food safety area, we see this a lot. As soon as something comes up in terms of a food the consumer preference just absolutely dives overnight.
Interestingly, in the wash-up of all this, so one of the things we did do that was sensible was engage a crisis communications manager, and the best advice he gave me was to shut up. Maybe I should take it more often.
I'll write that down, shut up.
But the other part of it was, as a consequence of this, I think something like 27% of consumers stopped eating strawberries, but 28% started eating strawberries. So actually there was no net loss, but that was no compensation to those growers who'd sprayed their strawberries out. So they never got that benefit. And I think as soon as we, got together and got that messaging around chop them up, don't cut them out, cut them up, don't cut them out, all of that kind of thing. But like I said, it did take everybody a few days to get their heads around it. And by the time that happened, unfortunately, we had that decision by the retailers. And, they operate on risk.
So you weren't able to engage with the supply chain in that first 48 hours, or it was just happening too fast?
It was happening too fast. And I think it's very easy to point the fingers at others, but one also must look at oneself. And I think it is very fair to say that the Australian strawberry industry was in complete disarray. Strawberries Australia was basically defunct. And so all of the burden got pushed onto the Queensland Strawberry Industry Development Officer, who deserves a medal. And then because we have a personal relationship, I got involved by the Queensland government. But I think, we did not as industry have those robust relationships with the retailers in place so that we could be part of that conversation. The outcome is that now we do.
Very good. All right, and just to point out again, when agricultural agencies are responding to a biosecurity or a food safety incident, it's not too bad. But once the Department of Health gets involved, and then again, once the police get involved, it becomes very, very complicated. And the first people kicked out of the door is usually the Agriculture Department, and Health and Police take over. So you did a good job in the end, I think, because, and I can tell you in our jurisdiction in South Australia, the police arrested 3 people for copycat incidences, and they've all been prosecuted. So it was a nightmare across the country.
And I think we do have to give credit to both Queensland DEF and Queensland Health, because once we sort of all kind of got ourselves pointing in the same direction, I don't think you could criticise in a lot of ways. I mean, there were certain things, but, I think there's been a very big spirit of openness and willingness to talk with one another to learn from their experience, and I think that is nothing but a good thing.
Okay, well, we might take some questions from the floor. What do you want to throw at our panel? You're all stunned. Andrew.
Can I ask the question, how would you get ready for the next one? What would you do now? What would you do now to, obviously you talked about the relationships you already built, but you don't know what's coming next.
Is this a question for me, Andrew?
Maybe all four, maybe Rachel, I'll give you a go, and then if the others want to chip in, you can, but we all need to be better prepared, and we need contingency plans, but you can't have a contingency plan for something you don't know what's coming.
Yeah, like I said, I think we have to let go of the illusion that we can always be prepared, first of all, because if it comes completely left of centre, we might not be prepared for that. But one of the things that I learned is around, it is about creating those networks and communication pathways and building the resilience of your industry, making sure your industry group is strong and functional, well-resourced, and also having government respect industry and know, we do all have each other's phone numbers now, but you should have in your phone the numbers that you need in government that you need to call immediately if something hits the proverbial, basically. And also one other thing that crisis manager often reinforced to me is that industry or agriculture needs to build up a reservoir of goodwill in the public's mind so that it can withstand the knocks. And in the case of the strawberries, we were the victim of the poor strawberry industry, so that enabled us, that was something that helped us. But sometimes, unfortunately, it could be a failing in a food safety process, and so we need to make sure that we have a big reservoir of goodwill with the public to withstand perhaps times when things aren't perfect.
Next.
I think. Am I
Go
still
on.
going,
Yeah,
or am I?
go on.
I guess the point that I was going to make, building on your point, that is how you get prepared. Is exactly what. That's how you get ready. Is that you get prepared in that really strategic way, that you know where your high risks are and what they mean. You know you've got the networks established. You know who to go to. So depending upon what type of crisis it is, you press the different buttons as to how you respond, but you need to prepare really broadly. So the banana industry's got another terrible pest in northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland called bunchy top virus. Now, if that gets into North Queensland, it's just not going to be nice. So we are putting in place, we're starting to talk about a plan. What do we do? How do we manage this? And there is a project actively trying to contain the disease, but we've got to be thinking lot more further into the future. Is what we do about that.
In terms of prawns, that's a very interesting question you raised, because the first incursion into Australia under the OIE guidelines is eradication. And we're in the 2-year proof of freedom period now, so it's unlikely that if there was a subsequent outbreak of white spot, for instance, that the response would look the same. So it's very interesting question in terms of prawns. So it could be another disease. There's obviously potential for that. In fact, the new import risk assessment will start to address some of those emerging diseases. And since White Spot 2016, there's an overarching biosecurity plan for industry, and there's also site-specific one. And as the ladies here have pointed out, with all of the contact details and all of those types of things for a first response. But on the eradication type level and the chlorine and the response of Biosecurity Queensland, I would say that the aquatic CCAD would meet, and they would formulate a quite different response.
Other questions? Pat?
Thanks. I just want to build on what you've said there, Alistair, and I guess as well, Michelle, the banana story. I guess in the 8 or 9 years I've been in biosecurity, there's a consistent issue in that first 48 hours, and JP raised it this morning. That's uncertainty. Often it's uncertainty associated with the science of the disease or the pest. Always it's uncertainty about how far this thing's gone before we're actually able to do something about it. But the expectations of decision makers and farmers are that someone in the system knows everything. And everyone gets the finger pointed at them to say, why the bloody hell didn't you know about this, or why the bloody hell aren't you able to press the button now and fix it straight away? Because every day that ticks over, there's more damage done, and there's more investment lost, and there's more goodwill lost and trust lost. And so the thing that's challenging me is, how do we make sure we are authentic during that first 48 hours, and we're in a position that everyone can honestly say, I don't know, we're going to find out, but we've just got to hold the fort, or what's the answer when we genuinely don't know?
I genuinely don't know. I think if you can't make something up. So I think you have to be honest and hope that the relationship that you have with that stakeholder is strong enough that it can get through that we don't know, but we're trying to find out. And I guess it's that second part, it's that I don't know, but this is what we're doing to try and find out. And for TR4, there was uncertainty about what sterilising agent you could use on your equipment and your shoes, and people thought one thing was okay, and if they went out and there was, you couldn't buy a particular brand of product in all of North Queensland. And then it turned out, no, actually that's not the best one to be using, the best one's this one. But we only knew that through trials because we instantly went in and started and set up some R&D trials to work it out to get more answers. So the answers are slow, and sometimes they're slow, and I don't know how you get around that. I mean, Andrew said that this morning, it's deeply frustrating, and we understood how frustrating it is, it was at the time. But if the answers aren't there, they're not there. I don't know how you ride that through.
I think a lot of the industries are looking to the agencies as the point of truth that we spoke about earlier. And that is difficult, and I think we need to go out and say, we don't know, but we're trying to find out. And that's when you get international experts in and other people who may have been studying that disease to try and advise us. And that happens a lot in Australia because we don't get a lot of exotic diseases, so we do rely on people in other countries, and that can take some time. But it's pretty frenetic in the first 48 hours. Guys like Pat, when industry comes in and says, why don't you know the answer? What's happened here? How did you let it in? So I don't know how you manage that really. We just sort of let a lot of it go through to the keeper because there's no answer to it. It's what do we need to do now to mitigate or restrict the impact that this certain exotic pest is going to have on our industry now. It's very emotional for the industry.
Yeah, I definitely rely on some of those long-standing relationships, like guys like Kerrod Beattie who's been seconded to Biosecurity. Now I've known Kerrod for many, many years, so I think we have a certain level of trust there, and so I think you do rely on those relationships a lot, definitely.
I'd like to wind it back one step. We did get a notification of a resolution for fire ants, but because we did such a great job at that, for the following 2 to 3 years, every couple of weeks, we would, for vessels at moorings and down the lines, you'd see an ant or a this or a that, which we, of course, would take a photo of, get a sample, raise an internal incident, race it off to you guys and there was a lot of pressure in our business because we were so focused on ensuring we were managing biosecurity. A lot of, what is it? I said, I don't know. We're going to have to wait. And, that is a hard sell. But the key thing is you have to wait for the specialist to give you the answer. It was a positive thing, and we don't discourage it, but it is hard to hold that line when there's a lot of pressure on you to tell, the organisation what the problem or issue is. We were very lucky. All the ones come back, and they weren't obviously any pests to be concerned about.
Something I've just thought of is you tell them, what you can tell them is you've got to keep it off your farm. So that's what you've got to do. So it's about biosecurity, and you get it in place and you do it now. So whilst we're still trying to find out about the disease and its spread and where it is, do everything you can to keep it off your farm, I guess, as a response.
Malcolm.
That was going to be my question, Michelle. It was the pressure between communicating to the general public and the supply chain and communications around delimitation, containment, dealing directly, the technical stuff dealing directly with the incident in the industry liaison officer role. So it's a question probably for you and maybe for Helen as well in terms of how you make decisions in relation to what your priorities are in that space.
The priorities sort of they present themselves to you. It just becomes this, there is a wave, but you've got to stand in the shoes of a grower, and it's like, okay, what do they need to know? How soon do they need to know it? What's the best way to communicate that? And so it becomes your filter for everything that you're hearing and doing. And, I guess that then sets your priorities. So there are other things. So BQ might have wanted us to go and do something or to get something to them by a certain, time frame. And we would always try and do that. But for us, the growers' need was always the number one priority.
I think that highlights to me, and it's across a range of things, but it's the power of people and the power that you as a person who understood the industry and had those connections with industry, but also understood the department and had the connections with the department, could be that interface. And I think, you know, so often these days we rely on electronic communications or other forms of communication, but at the end of the day, sometimes with these crisis situations, having a person who understands and has empathy and can be that bridge between the two systems is really important.
All right, thank you. I might just do a bit of a wrap up. So what I heard from you guys, first 48 hours in a response, got to be nimble, agile. You're looking for predictable information. Industry is very emotional, as are other responders, I can tell you. Trust BQ, that's a good one, Malcolm. Don't panic, but you're right, you have that sweet spot for a short time where you can get a few things done and start communicating to people before it hits the media. Get your stuff together, I think you said, Rachel. Bit of a blur. It's a bit of a whirlwind in those 48 hours. Everyone really is running around like chooks with their heads cut off, trying to get set up for the next, 2 or 3 days or 7 days. It's always a blur, as most emergencies are. Identify the go-to people. That's a good message, Industry needs to know who they can ring in government, even academia, experts in your field, even if they're in Brussels, you should know who they are. Media management, very, very important. Industry has to identify who their spokesperson is. Government does that immediately. It's probably going to be Malcolm or Pat up in Queensland, and no one else says anything, because if you can't manage that media in early days, it can all go pear-shaped on you. Building networks, really important in peacetime. Now we need to build our networks. No good trying to do it in wartime. It's much more difficult, and personal relationships do go a long way. But isn't it interesting how, and we see this all the time in emergency management, a crisis brings us all together. And you think sometimes, wouldn't it be great if we could work like we do in an emergency all the time? Wouldn't things work wonderfully well? But could you please thank our 4 panellists?